What are your scariest encounters with real people? Well, I hope that she was real. In Toronto there is a subway system run by the TTC or Toronto Transit Commission. They often square off certain parts of the subway route, which is pretty basic, in order to do some upgrades or fix bits. Lately they've been shutting down the subway rides into downtown on the weekends. Anyway, they were doing some upgrades on the track and we were going by pretty slow, making sure not to run over anyone while they scampered out of the way. Out of nowhere the power cut out. Now, I should say that I wasn't the only one in the train car. The cars are decently long and I was at one end. And some woman was at the other end. When I walked onto the train it was up at her end where there was a giant bubble of seats empty around her. She was displaying the typical signs of crazy and people sort of avoided her. Everyone else was off. Getting off at Yonge, but I still had another couple stops east to go. She was laughing audibly. And I tried to tune it out by listening to some music, but it never really worked. It was so chilling that my brain sort of just kept ignoring the music and focusing on her. So eventually I just unplugged the music and sat back, trying not to shit my pants. So anyway, the power cuts out and here I am sitting at one end, as far away from her as I could possibly be. And the lights turn off for some reason. She stopped laughing. In fact, she stopped making any noise at all. When the lights came back on about 5 seconds later, when I had sufficiently shit my pants, she wasn't at the far end. She was about 3 seats away from me, staring at me. The second the train stopped I bolted for the door. After she relocated she didn't make another sound. She just kept staring. Creepiest moment of my goddamn life. I'm so happy this question was asked. This is the only good story in my whole life. Growing up, I always wanted to go on a bike ride at night. Something about it seemed really cool to me. It wasn't until I was 13 that my mom finally let me. She told me to wear my helmet, have my phone, take a flashlight, and she set the parameters for where I was allowed to go. She gave me about 4 miles, which was a lot to me. So right after the sunset, I was off. I loved it. There were no people out walking their dogs, no kids running around. The temperature was perfect, etc. It was really fun. So fun that I ignored the limits my mom set. You see, where I was biking was all walking paths. It was one of those grassy areas between 2 neighborhoods. There's this long path that went at least 600 feet at a 25-degree angle. I was flying down this hill, having an absolute blast, and darted right through the parameters. My mom set these limits for a reason. Everything on the inside was closed to houses and people. The outside, more specifically, the place where the path I was on led to, was barren. I rode along this path for 10 minutes before I could only see some of the lights of the houses on the inside of the limits. After 15 minutes of riding along this dirt path, I hear singing. It sounded about 30-40 feet in front of me. I stopped riding to hear it better. It was a woman's voice. She was singing Eleanor Rigby by the Beatles. But she wasn't singing the words, just the melody of the vocals. Her voice was strange. You know how when you have phlegm in your throat, your voice gets scratchy? That's what her voice sounded like. I inch forward to try and see her. I get close enough to see the silhouette of hair bouncing up and down, like she was headbanging. I decide to get my flashlight out. I'm thinking that maybe this person is in need of help or something. Or maybe this is an insane person and the light will scare them away. So I take the flashlight out of my pocket, point it at her, and turn it on. The moment the light hit her, she stopped moving completely. She was facing away from me. She had disgusting hair that seemed to be sticking together in clumps. Some of her hair was ripped off, too. She was wearing a very oversized, bright red hoodie. I was almost too scared to move. I think she was, too. I conjured up as much bravery as I could and said sorry in a very, oops, this is the wrong room kind of way. She didn't respond. I turned off the flashlight and put it back in my pocket. Just as I was turning my bike around, she screams. She screams in an awful, high-pitched voice. I damn near sh myself as I throw myself back onto my bike. I hear her voice getting closer to me. I book it as fast as I can. I don't look behind me. And I don't stop pedaling. Her screaming grew quieter and quieter until it dissolved into the howling of the wind. This story is 100% true. I experienced it myself in the summer of 1991. When I was about 10 years old. I lived on Woodway Drive in the Fox Harbor Apartments in Paducah, KY. If you look up the address, you will see some woods just to the north of the apartment complex. My friends and I played in those woods every day after school and all day on the weekends. Through the few years I lived there, we cleared a small area in the woods and created a fort from various things we got out of dumpsters. It was our own place that no one else knew about. And it was awesome. One day as we were walking to our fort, off in the distance we saw a man walking through the woods. He was walking parallel to us, but in the opposite direction like cars traveling on a road, but with about 70-80 yards separating our paths. We stopped talking and stopped dead in our tracks when we saw him. We never saw anyone in the woods, especially not adults. When we stopped moving, he did too. He turned towards us and looked right at us. As I stared at him and was able to make out the details of what he looked like, I noticed that he was wearing what looked like a Halloween mask, a generic mask, not Michael Myers, and carrying an axe in his hands. We stood there in silence and motionless for what was probably about 10 seconds, he looking at us, and us looking at him. He started sprinting straight at us. We did the only thing we apparently thought to do. Run straight to our fort. We were probably about 50 yards from the entrance to the fort, and in those 50 yards he gained a lot of ground on us. When we finally made it, he was upon us. All of my friends scurried up a tree and were screaming. But I was the last in line. By the time I could try and climb the tree, he was standing right there by us. He was screaming like a lunatic and waving the axe in the air. I was scared. Had no idea what was going on. And my mind was blank on what I should do. I grabbed a large stick and took a nice big baseball bat swing and cracked him on the face with it. He stumbled back a bit, moaned and took the mask off. I recognized the face. It was the landlord and manager of the apartment complex. A man who was probably about 50 years old. He wanted to play a joke on us and thought this was the most appropriate thing to do. He was a reffing psycho. One night, around 3 AM, I was asleep with my ex-boyfriend next to me. All of a sudden I hear someone in my house asking if anyone was home. I woke up my ex and told him to go see what the hell was going on. He was a total chicken shit, made me go. I get out of bed. Can't find my glasses, but the guy is still shouting. I come out of my bedroom in my pajamas and see there is a big bald dude in what looks to be a police uniform standing in my entryway. I'm squinting trying to get a good look at him, and he looks at me and says, "I just wanted to tell you that your door was left unlocked and you should lock it." I mumble something to the effect of "Thanks." And he leaves my apartment. I'm still as blind as a bat, but I see that he walks away instead of getting into a car. No policeman would be policing the woodsy area I live in on foot. The next day I called the local police station and asked if any officers had reported this incident, and they said they would check with the on-duty officers and get back to me. They called me the next day and said no one had done this. I still get freaked out when I think about this happening, and I wish I knew what that guy was up to. He was probably trying to rob your house, but wanted to see if anyone was home. Last year in my town someone kicked in 3 doors, waited to see if there was noise, and ended up leaving because all of the homeowners were home. My sister's bedroom was on the 2nd floor. All of a sudden she screamed and said she saw a hand on her window. We thought she was having a nightmare. Told her to go back to bed. Next morning we found a ladder up against our house by her window. Edit, haha. I see people are freaked. It was the 2nd floor. It was normal house. I don't know if that helps or hurts. But the top of the ladder reached it. Also, it happened in 1987. So you can relax a little. Here is a very creepy thing that happened to me. One winter I was pushing my limits and winter camping a lot. But I had this crazy tent with a fireplace. The limits part was just the fact that I was solo and pretty remote in these places. This was rural SW Colorado Canyon country. There wasn't that much snow at all on the ground, but it was 0 degrees Fahrenheit that night. Well, it was a full moon and I was restless, so at about 2 AM I got out of my tent, fire still going, and went for a long walk. I ended up climbing up some stuff that was probably a quarter or half mile from my tent vehicle, but up above it so I could see down on my tent and campsite clearly. It was really beautiful down there. Dimly lit from the inside by the stove's fire and dimly lit from the outside by the big moon. I was enjoying myself and just about to head back down when I heard distant gravel crunching. I had been there since noon that day and not a single vehicle had driven past, so I was kind of put off and decided to stay up there until they drove past. The noise grows louder, amazing how far away you can head in the canyons at night. Slowly and eventually I can see that it is a car on the same road, so I stay put and watch. It's going really slow. I can see a lighter being used quite a bit. I'm not saying they were smoking meth. But they were smoking meth. And it's something like a '89 Caprice or something. Like the old cop cars. And really crappy. So I'm just watching. Still in a very wistful mood and feeling somewhat powerful from my perch. Near the bend where they'll be able to see my tent and round the corner. Brake lights. They slow way down and seem to pause at my tent for an eternity. Probably only a minute or so, but now I was on high alert and pretty nerve-wracking. I had no kind of anything weapon-wise on me. Just a hatchet down by the tent for firewood. But they drive on. I'm pretty relieved but still shaken. Now thinking about what if they come back. So I decide to chill for a little longer and make sure I see them exit. Nope. They turned around down the road and came back. I watched as they parked a ways down the road and got out and started walking down the road towards my camp. It was such bright moonlight with slick rocks all around that I could see this all happening somewhat clearly, but I couldn't make out much more than the basic scenes and there were still lots of big shadows. I proceed to watch for quite a while as they approach my tent. Look all around the outside. Look in the vents, where it probably looked like I was sleeping. The bag was in there with bedding. Mess with my vehicle. And then walk back to their car and leave. I pretty much stayed up there until just before dawn and only came down when I knew I could break camp and bail. There were footprints in the snow on the outside of my tent and I kept imagining what it would have been like to have just woken up and not known what happened. Just see the footprints. After that I started carrying a spot locator beacon B, battery powered motion detector alarm C, shotgun. And I started using a much smaller tent, and sometimes I even camp in a bivvy 20 or 30 feet away from my tent and just put my pack in the tent. This way if someone starts messing with the honeypot I have enough to get some awareness and do the right thing. TLDR, potential serial murderers passed me by. When I was 18 I worked the evening shift at a convenience store. Over the previous 3 nights 3 stores from the same chain had been held up at gunpoint in my small city. So my manager had basically been prepping me all week to get robbed. I was, understandably, on edge all night. I was down to the last few hours of my shift and I was finally starting to calm down a little bit when a guy with his hat pulled down low walked in. Came right up to the counter. And started reaching into the inside of his jacket and said, "You know those days when you should have just stayed home? I think this is one of them." Time was moving in slow motion at this point and my heart was beating out of my chest. After what felt like 10 minutes the guy pulled his wallet out of his jacket and asked for a pack of cigarettes. Anticlimactic. But scary nonetheless.